Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tosh Talk. I am your host, Tosh Berman. I sort of forget my name once in a while. Tosh Berman, Tosh Talk. And today I want to talk about a vinyl LP box set that I'm very, very excited about. It's called Ork Records, New York, New York. And Ork Records was a label that started in, take a guess, New York City in the year 1975. And it was started by a gentleman by the name of Terry Ork. And that is not even his real name. He's sort of a mysterious figure, Terry Ork. He was born in San Diego, or he lived in San Diego. And during the early 70s or late 60s, he ended up in New York City, in Manhattan, and became associated with the scene at the Andy Warhol's factory. He got a job there through Gerard Malenga, who was Andy Warhol's assistant, to make silk screens and this sort of reporting what parties are happening that day or night. That was his role. Social director, as well as helping with the screen, making the screens. And he eventually, his main passion, strangely enough, was not music. His main passion is the cinema. He was a huge French New Wave fan, huge fan of Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard. And he worked in a bookstore, where I wrote it down, it's called Cinemabilia in Greenwich Village in New York. And he eventually became a manager at this store after he left Warhol's factory, due, not proven, but he may have taken some property from the factory, maybe a silk screen or two. He was fired for something like that, and then eventually he ended up in this bookstore, which just focused on cinema, like rare cinema stills, used and new books on the cinema, and movie posters. He became a manager of the store, and he hired a gentleman by the name of Richard Myers, who eventually became Richard Hell. So through Richard Hell, he met a gentleman who was a childhood friend of Richard Meyer back in Kentucky by the name of Tom Miller, who eventually becomes Tom Verlaine. And Tom and Richard were poets at the time, budding musicians, especially Tom Verlaine. But their main focus in the early years were writing poetry. And they're very much influenced, I think, by French symbolist poetry and surrealism. And therefore, that's why you have Tom Verlaine, named after the poet Paul Verlaine. And of course, not Richard Rimbaud, but Richard Hell. So the Hell Verlaine is like the Verlaine and Rimbaud relationship. In a sense, in theory, this became a new partnership, a creative partnership. And they wrote poetry together, they did a book together, and as well as writing poetry separately. And this all happened under Terry Ork's world. And eventually, Richard Hell and Tom Verlaine started a band called Television. Television, I can't speak for you out there who's watching this, but Television is like a major, beyond even music thing. I discovered Television actually in the year 75, 76, not through their music, but actually a photograph of Tom Verlaine and Richard Hell. They were sitting on a couch, Richard Hell looking at the camera directly, and Tom Verlaine with his side looking that way, but his eyes looking towards the lens. I was so intrigued by this photograph, specifically what they were wearing, which is sort of a kind of cut up clothing, used clothes, I'm not sure what it was, but I was really impressed by their haircuts. They had incredible haircuts. And this sounds kind of surfacey on my part or kind of stupid, but you know, when I see a picture of a guy or a girl with a really great haircut, it really makes a big impression on me. When I see a great photograph of two musicians that look really good, I have to presume the music is great. And to be honest, to this very day, all great music is made by musicians who have great haircuts. So in 1975, 1976, the band Television existed, and their history is pretty well known if you know about the New York punk world and the art world at the time in Manhattan. And again, this is sort of like this is like ground zero for, to me at the time, what everything great is happening in New York. And I lived in Los Angeles at the time, and I was a teenager, and I would get my information about these bands from reading the Village Voice, which we subscribed to, and I would just go right into the music section of that paper. And they had so many things about all these CBGB bands like Blondie, Television, of course, the Mumps, the Marbles, Blondie, and so forth, and the Ramones. We can't forget the Ramones. And I was just so intrigued by the image of these people and what they may have sound like. I see their pictures, and I sort of, in my head, projected what their sound is. You know, so in a way, I look at their picture, I sort of got the essence who they are. And oddly enough, when I eventually, months later or even years later, I hear their recordings, they sound very much what they look like. Anyway, Terry Ork. Terry Ork, though not a music person, knew this is something was really happening. You know, so from the very beginning, he started managing, quote unquote, Television. And he helped put together a label for the sole purpose of releasing Television's 7-inch single. It's probably the first 7-inch punk rock single, independently made, do it yourself, and with the help of Billy on drums, the great Richard Lloyd on guitar, and of course Verlaine on the other guitar, and Richard Hell on bass. Though at the time of the recording of the single, Richard Hell left and was replaced by a bass player by the name of Fred Smith, who used to be in Blondie for a while. It's a long Pandora's box history here. But nevertheless, Television released a single called Little Johnny Jewel, Part 1 and Part 2. It's a 7-minute song, and it's on a 7-inch record, so you get the first A-side is first like 3 or 4 minutes of song, you turn to the B-side, and the song continues. Sort of based on like the James Brown singles, the great Keen label James Brown singles of that period, where you get like Hot Pants Part 1 and Hot Pants Part 2 on the B-side, which is mostly instrumental, and this is sort of the same format. So Ork Records was made really by Tom Verlaine and Television just to put this one record out. But they called it Ork Records in the tribute to their manager, Terry Ork. Ork eventually just kept the label and kept it going. His next release was Richard Hell's new band, Richard Hell and the Voidoids, and it was Blank Generation, and he put that out. Again, a do-it-yourself, probably a limited edition of, I don't know, 1,000 copies, I don't know. I remember the time in the 70s, I used to go to a record store called Bomp Records. And Bomp Records was located in the Valley, and I used to go there to buy independent music records. I mean, this whole punk scene was starting up. And the word punk is not even, it's just outdated even to use that word, but there's that glorious time when you can go to a really great record store and find brand new artists from different parts of the world, you know, like, well, Los Angeles had a punk scene, San Francisco had its scene, and the one I was really interested in at the time was New York, and then second choice would be London, you know, with all the Sex Pistols, Clash, and Subway Sec and so forth, the Slits and so forth. And, but the New York thing was I was so in tune to that world just because of the romantic notion of New York and Manhattan in my brain and my eyes. And Ork Records was almost like, seems to me, custom made for my taste and my aesthetic. So I remember buying Little Johnny Jewel when it first came out. This one record store in the Valley, San Fernando Valley, probably the only record store that carried these records. I purchased that. And I purchased other Ork records as well as the Richard Hell and the Voidoids Blank Generation EP. And then eventually I bought the Sneakers, who was Chris Stamey's band, and I bought Alex Shelton's single after he left Big Star. Anyway, all this is associated with Ork Records. Fantastic label, amazing label. And what I'm going to show you is a box set, very mysterious. Here's these two guys. Who are these two people? Well, one is Terry Ork, and the other guy is Charles Ball. Charles Ball was more of the financial person, and Terry Ork is the, well, we know who Terry Ork is. Anyway, in this box set, there's 4 records. These are all the original recordings of Ork Records when it was released on 12-inch albums. So there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, and there's 4. So anyway, 4 albums of the original music on Ork Records, and not only that, but you get this incredible, I'm sounding like an info commercial, I know, I'm sorry, but this is like an incredible hardcover book with great graphics, great posters, great billings of the bands of Toljan of that time and other CBGBs type of acts, and the history of Ork Records. A beautifully illustrated book. And the book alone is actually worth the price of the whole box set. It's a fantastic book. I think this whole set is like a limited edition of maybe a couple of thousand. So I really recommend you get it if you have a chance. And again, there are many compilations of sort of the history of, like, say, like this New York punk rock or New York new rock. But I feel Ork Records is the essential package to get the feeling of what it was like during that time when these records were released. And reading and listening to the music, which is incredible. There's not one bad song on this album. The history is so vivid and so wonderful. And it's very, for me, it's like going back, not really, you're going back in time, but it's still a fresh movement, a fresh feeling about it. And, you just think, thank God there's people like Terry Ork, who was willing to hustle his way to make these 7-inch singles at the time, but that were barely distributed, and they were like masterpieces. And the bands that were on this, in this package and were on Ork Records and Ork-related records are Television, Richard Hell and the Voidoids, the Feelies, fantastic band, the Feelies, right? The Revons, the Student Teachers, totally unknown to me to this day till I bought this package. The Erasers, of all-female band. The great Alex Chilton of Big Star and Box Top. Alex Chilton went to New York right after after Big Star broke up, and he made recordings with Terry Ork. Incredible recordings, by the way. Chris Damey, who came from North Carolina, ended up in New York. Ended up starting his own label called Ork Records, with I think the help of Terry Ork, and his recordings are on this box set as well. And Chris Damey worked with Alex Chilton. The Marbles, Pricks, who I don't know anything about, sort of Alex Chilton related. The Idols are actually 2 members of the New York Dolls after they split up, Jerry Nolan and Arthur, who played the bass in the New York Dolls. The Idols sounds very much like the New York Dolls. Mick Farron, who's a British journalist and rock and roll guy, who went to New York and made a recording. And Richard Lloyd has 3 or 4 songs on this box set, and Richard Lloyd was the other guitar player in Television, and he's incredible, he's remarkable. And 2 of the songs that he covers are 2 Rolling Stones covers. And what's interesting, Ork Records, or Terry Ork, plan to do a tribute album to the Rolling Stones. And now it's not that uncommon for a label or somebody to do a tribute to a particular artist or band with different artists involved. But Terry Ork was probably the first one to actually think of doing a compilation of New York bands at the time doing Rolling Stones songs. And it was never been released as a full album, but we have at least 4 or 5, maybe 6 songs on this box set from that project. Lenny Kaye, who's a writer, ended up becoming Patti Smith's right or left-hand person in her band, and an excellent writer. And of course the legendary Lester Bangs, who is a noted rock and roll writer and quite influential critic, and his writing style is still to this day a huge influence on rock and roll literature. So Ork Records, New York, New York, essential buy. You must have it. You can get it as a CD set if you want to, but I prefer the vinyl because it's the nature of vinyl and the nature of that music just comes so much alive, and it's just a fantastic set. And I hope you'll get it, and I hope you'll come back to watch more of Tosh Talk with your host, Tosh Berman. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.